Welcome to Go to Sleep, Historian. Thank you for being here, and for choosing a quiet journey into the past. Tonight's story is designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently drift toward sleep as we explore history at its calmest pace. In this episode, we step away from fairy tales and ceremony to examine royal marriages as they truly were. Not stories of romance, but instruments of power, duty, and continuity. Across centuries, kings and queens were joined not by choice, but by necessity, shaping borders, dynasties, and the slow movement of history itself. There's nothing you need to remember, and nothing you need to imagine clearly. Simply listen, rest, and allow the story to unfold quietly. If you find comfort in slow history like this, consider subscribing to Go to Sleep Historian for more calm journeys into the past. As the spoken story begins, the music will remain gentle. When the narration fades, the music will continue softly, giving you time to drift peacefully into sleep. Now, let us begin. When people imagine royal marriages, they often picture scenes filled with music, jewels, and soft candlelight. There are visions of grand halls, embroidered garments, and solemn vows spoken beneath high stone ceilings. Over time, these images have been polished into something almost dreamlike, repeated in paintings, stories, and modern ceremonies. Yet beneath this familiar surface, royal marriage has long been something far quieter, more deliberate, and far less romantic than it appears. For most of history, marriage among royalty was not a personal milestone. It was not a celebration of affection or companionship. Instead, it functioned as a method, a carefully considered act meant to preserve stability, secure alliances, and extend power without raising an army. The wedding ceremony was simply the visible moment of an arrangement already decided, often years or even decades earlier. In royal households, children were raised with an understanding that their future was already outlined. From an early age, princes and princesses were taught lineage before emotion, duty before desire. They learned the names of distant kingdoms as easily as they learned prayers. These places were not just points on a map, but potential futures, lands they might one day rule, or courts they might be sent to live in, far from anything familiar. This knowledge was rarely spoken aloud in dramatic terms. There was no single moment when a child was told their marriage would serve a political purpose. Instead, the idea settled in gradually, like a slow habit of thought. Tutors explained genealogy. Advisors spoke of alliance. Courtiers mentioned neighboring rulers in tones of interest or caution. Over time, the message became clear, without ever being stated directly. Royal romance, as it is remembered today, is largely a later invention. Medieval and early modern chroniclers were far more interested in outcomes than emotions. They recorded to meritum, what territories changed hands, and whether the union produced an heir. Love, if it existed at all, was considered irrelevant to the historical record. In many cases, the bride and groom had never met before their wedding day. Sometimes they had exchanged letters, though these were often carefully supervised and formal. More commonly, they knew each other only through portraits, descriptions, and the reputations of their respective families. A face painted by an artist might be studied closely, not for attraction, but for signs of health and strength. Marriage negotiations themselves unfolded slowly and quietly. Envoys traveled between courts, carrying proposals and counterproposals. Discussions focused on borders, military obligations, inheritance rights, and religious alignment. Each detail was weighed carefully, adjusted, and by the time a wedding date was announced, the marriage had already fulfilled its primary purpose on paper. The ceremony, though grand, was almost an afterthought in political terms. Its main function was public confirmation. Witnesses were required not for celebration, but for legitimacy. The presence of nobles, clergy, and foreign representatives ensured that no one could later dispute what had taken place. The personal lives of royal couples were shaped by expectation rather than intimacy. They were rarely alone. Their movements were observed, their conversations overheard, their routines documented. Even private moments existed within a structure of protocol. Marriage, in this context, was less a partnership and more a shared responsibility. For queens especially, the transition could be abrupt. Many were sent far from their homes, arriving in unfamiliar lands where the language, customs, and climate were entirely different. Their role was clear from the beginning: to represent their birth family's interests while fully embodying their new dynasty. There was little space for hesitation or homesickness. Kings, too, were constrained, though in different ways. They were expected to maintain authority, produce heirs, and keep the balance of power intact. Personal dissatisfaction was considered an acceptable cost if stability was preserved. A successful marriage was one that functioned politically, regardless of how it felt. Over time, these unions shaped the map of the world. Borders shifted not through conquest, but through inheritance. Entire regions passed quietly from one ruling house to another because of a marriage contract signed years earlier. These changes were often gradual, unfolding across generations, making them easy to overlook. Because of this, royal marriages tend to fade into the background of history. Battles are remembered. Revolutions are examined in detail, but marriages, slow, methodical, and administrative, receive far less attention, despite their long-lasting consequences. Yet within these arrangements were real people, living real lives shaped by decisions made long before they could object. Their emotions were secondary, their preferences negotiable. What mattered was continuity, the steady passing of power from one generation to the next. As time moved forward, stories softened these realities. Later retellings added affection where records were silent. Paintings emphasized tenderness. Modern ceremonies echoed tradition while quietly removing its harsher edges. The illusion of royal romance grew stronger, even as its historical foundations remained unchanged. To understand royal marriage as it truly was requires slowing down and looking past the spectacle. It means seeing these unions not as stories of love, but as instruments of order. They were built on patience, compromise, and acceptance of duty. In this quiet space between image and reality, history reveals something subtle and enduring. Royal marriages were not designed to inspire passion. They were meant to prevent chaos, and in that purpose, they were often successful. As we move forward, this calm understanding will guide us. Each chapter will unfold another layer of this long tradition, not through drama, but through quiet observation, where power moved gently and lives adjusted accordingly. For now, it is enough to rest with this simple truth. Behind every crown joined in marriage, there was a plan, unfolding slowly, and rarely asking how anyone felt about it. In the long history of monarchy, marriage functioned less as a personal bond and more as an extension of governance. It was one of the quiet tools of statecraft, used alongside treaties, laws, and diplomacy, where armies demanded resources and left visible scars. Marriage worked slowly, almost invisibly, reshaping relationships between kingdoms without the sound of marching feet. Rulers understood early that a wedding could accomplish what years of conflict could not. A single union had the power to turn rivals into relatives, to calm disputed borders, or to secure loyalty, where force might provoke resistance. This made marriage one of the most reliable instruments in a ruler's planning, valued for its predictability and long-term influence. Negotiations surrounding royal marriages followed a rhythm familiar to diplomacy. Messengers traveled back and forth between courts, carrying proposals that were rarely straightforward. Each side considered what it stood to gain and what it was willing to surrender. Land, military support, trade privileges, and succession rights were discussed patiently, often revised many times before agreement was reached. These discussions could last for years. In some cases, a marriage was arranged when the future bride or groom was still a child. The delay allowed political circumstances to stabilize or to shift into more favorable conditions. During this waiting period, the engagement itself already served its purpose. The promise of alliance influenced behavior, discouraged aggression, and encouraged cooperation. Marriage contracts were detailed documents, written with careful attention to every possible outcome. They outlined financial arrangements, inheritance rules, and expectations of loyalty. These agreements often anticipated future complications, including the death of one spouse, the absence of heirs, or changes in religious or political authority. In this way, marriage was treated not as a moment, but as a process extending across generations. One of the most important elements in these arrangements was territory. Land could pass through marriage as smoothly as it might through conquest, but without bloodshed. A princess might bring a duchy as part of her dowry, or a prince might gain claim to distant lands through his spouse's lineage. Over time, Such transfers quietly redrew maps. These changes were rarely immediate. Often, they unfolded gradually, becoming fully realized only when an heir inherited both parents' titles. This slow pace reduced resistance. Subjects adjusted, administrations merged, and new rulers arrived with legal claims already established. What might have caused unrest through force was instead accepted as continuity. Marriage also served as a form of reassurance. When two ruling families were bound by blood, open conflict became less likely. War against a relative carried not only political risk, but personal complication. Even when tensions remained, marriage created hesitation, encouraging negotiation over confrontation. Yet this stability came at a cost. Royal individuals were expected to embody these political goals regardless of personal inclination. Their value lay in their ability to connect families and secure futures. Emotional compatibility was secondary, often ignored entirely. Success was measured not in happiness, but in outcomes. In many courts, marriage decisions were made collectively. Councils of advisors, clergy, and senior nobles debated potential matches. Each candidate was evaluated carefully. Their health, fertility, religious alignment, and family reputation were considered in quiet detail. The individuals themselves were often absent from these discussions, their futures decided without their presence. Once a decision was reached, it was presented as inevitable. Resistance was rare, not because it did not exist, but because it was impractical. Refusing a marriage could destabilize alliances, provoke conflict, or weaken claims. The weight of expectation left little room for personal preference. Royal weddings, then, were moments of confirmation rather than choice. The ceremony marked the completion of a political process already finalized. Public celebration masked the administrative nature of the event, transforming negotiation into spectacle. After marriage, the couple became symbols of unity. Their appearances together reinforced the alliance they represented. Their shared presence at ceremonies, councils, and religious observances reminded others of the bond between their families. Even silence between them could be interpreted as political meaning. In this way, marriage extended into daily governance. Decisions made in one court were influenced by relationships established through marriage elsewhere. A ruler might hesitate to challenge a neighboring kingdom if it meant opposing a son-in-law or jeopardizing a grandchild's inheritance. These considerations added layers of restraint to political action. Over time, complex networks of related rulers emerged. Courts across Europe and beyond became linked through marriage, creating webs of kinship that shaped diplomacy. Understanding these connections was essential for anyone involved in politics. Alliances were rarely simple, and loyalties often overlapped. Despite its effectiveness, marriage as a tool of state was not without risk. Unexpected deaths, infertility, or disputed succession could unravel carefully laid plans. A single broken link in the chain could introduce uncertainty. For this reason, rulers often arranged multiple marriages within their families, reinforcing alliances and spreading risk. This approach treated marriage as strategy rather than story. It was a long-term investment, measured across decades. Its success depended on patience, continuity, and acceptance of uncertainty. As centuries passed, the method remained largely unchanged. While the language surrounding marriage softened, its function endured. Even as romantic ideals gained prominence in later eras, the underlying logic of dynastic union persisted. Understanding this quiet role of marriage allows us to see history from a calmer distance. Instead of focusing on emotion or spectacle, we observe systems at work, slow, deliberate, and persistent. Marriage, in this context, was governance by other means. It shaped borders, preserved peace, and extended influence without violence. It asked for little noise and offered long-lasting results. In the stillness of these arrangements, power moved gently, carried forward not by force, but by agreement. And in that slow movement, the foundations of many modern states were laid. Long before any marriage ceremony took place, the foundations of royal unions were laid quietly in childhood. Princes and princesses did not grow up with open futures. Their lives were shaped from the beginning by expectations that settled gently but firmly around them, guiding their education, behavior, and sense of self. Royal childhoods were structured environments. Days were carefully organized, filled with lessons designed to prepare young heirs for roles they would one day inherit. Tutors taught languages, history, and religion, not for curiosity, but for usefulness. A child who might one day be sent abroad needed to speak fluently and understand unfamiliar customs. Knowledge was not personal enrichment. It was preparation. Within this education, marriage appeared early as a concept, though rarely as a personal choice. Genealogy charts were studied with the same seriousness as scripture. Children learned how families were connected, which houses were allied, and which relationships carried political meaning. Names repeated themselves across generations, reinforcing the idea that identity was inseparable from lineage. There was no dramatic announcement declaring that a child's marriage would serve the state. Instead, the understanding emerged gradually. Conversations among adults were overheard. Casual remarks hinted at future alliances. A visiting envoy might be treated with particular interest, or a portrait might be discussed with unusual attention. Over time, these small details formed a clear pattern. Royal children learned early how to behave under observation. Every movement was noticed, every word remembered. They were taught restraint, composure, and silence. Emotional expression was not forbidden, but it was carefully managed. Strong feelings, especially those that conflicted with duty, were gently discouraged. Friendships existed, but they were rarely uncomplicated. Companions were chosen carefully, often from families of similar rank. Relationships were polite and structured. The idea of romantic attachment was distant, abstract, and largely irrelevant to daily life. As adolescence approached, the sense of obligation became clearer. Young royals began to understand that their bodies, futures, and personal desires were part of larger calculations. Marriage was not something they would decide. It was something that would happen at the appropriate time to the appropriate person. This realization did not always arrive with resistance. Many accepted it quietly, having known no alternative. Duty was presented not as a burden, but as a natural extension of identity. To belong to a royal family meant to serve its continuity. Personal sacrifice was framed as tradition rather than loss. Yet, beneath this acceptance, uncertainty often lingered. The future spouse was usually unknown, existing only as a name, a title, or a painted likeness. The destination was often unfamiliar, sometimes far away. Language, climate, and culture might be entirely different. These details were acknowledged calmly, but they shaped unspoken fears. Preparation intensified as engagement approached. Young royals were trained in court etiquette specific to their future home. They practiced ceremonies they did not fully understand, learning where to stand, when to speak, and how to remain still for long periods. These rehearsals were quiet, methodical, and repetitive. Families participated in this process with measured distance. Parents, themselves often married for political reasons, reinforced expectations gently. They spoke of honor, responsibility, and continuity. Rarely did they offer reassurance about happiness, because happiness was not guaranteed nor required. Leaving home was one of the most significant moments in a royal child's life. Departure was often ceremonial, but emotionally restrained. Tears were discouraged. The transition was presented as a step forward, not a loss. The young royal was reminded that they represented their family wherever they went. Arrival in a new court could be overwhelming. Everything was unfamiliar, yet nothing was allowed to appear uncertain. From the moment they arrived, they were observed closely. Every gesture was interpreted, every silence noted. The pressure to adapt quickly was constant, though rarely spoken aloud. Marriage soon followed, often within days or weeks of arrival. There was little time to form personal impressions. The ceremony completed a process that had begun long ago, long before either participant could influence it. After marriage, childhood officially ended. The newly married royal was expected to embody maturity, stability, and composure. Mistakes were less forgivable. Expectations increased quietly but steadily. For many, this transition was accompanied by a sense of narrowing. The world became smaller, defined by routine, ceremony, and responsibility. Freedom, if it had ever existed, faded into memory. Yet within this structure, some found a kind of calm. Predictability offered security. Knowing what was expected reduced uncertainty. Duty provided purpose. These were not dramatic lives, but they were stable. Others experienced isolation, separation from family, cultural dislocation, and emotional distance could weigh heavily. These feelings were rarely recorded. Historical sources focus on outcomes, not inner experience. Silence fills the spaces where personal reflections might have been. Still, the pattern continued, generation after generation. Children were raised to fulfill obligations they did not choose, ensuring the persistence of dynasties. Individual stories blended into a larger system that valued continuity above all else. In this way, royal marriages were shaped long before vows were spoken. They began in classrooms, corridors, and quiet lessons learned through observation. By the time marriage arrived, it felt less like a turning point and more like a confirmation of something already known. This quiet conditioning explains much about royal behavior. Acceptance was not sudden. It was cultivated slowly. Resistance, though possible, was rare, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt unthinkable. As we move forward, this understanding will remain important. Royal marriages were not isolated events. They were the culmination of lifelong preparation, rooted deeply in childhood. And so, before alliances were sealed and territories exchanged, there were children learning to be still, learning to wait, and learning that their lives belonged, in part, to history itself. In royal marriage, affection was rarely the most valuable thing exchanged. What mattered more were the quiet transfers that accompanied the vows. Gold counted carefully, lands described in detail, and rights to inherit written into contracts. These elements formed the true foundation of many unions, shaping the political landscape long after the wedding celebrations ended. Dowries were not symbolic gifts. They were substantial and precisely calculated contributions meant to balance power between families. A bride might bring coin, jewels, fortresses, ports, or entire territories. Each item carried meaning. Gold strengthened treasuries. Land extended influence. Strategic locations offered control over trade routes or borders. Negotiating a dowry required patience and attention. Envoys discussed values at length, comparing what each side offered and what each expected in return. Nothing was left vague. Every town, field, and revenue source was identified clearly, often accompanied by maps and legal descriptions. These agreements aimed to prevent disputes long after those who signed them were gone. In some cases, dowries functioned as compensation. A powerful kingdom might demand substantial assets in exchange for offering protection or legitimacy. In others, dowries served as incentives, encouraging a stronger dynasty to accept an alliance with a weaker one. The balance was delicate. An insufficient dowry could signal weakness, while an excessive one could provoke resentment or suspicion. Lands transferred through marriage did not always change hands immediately. Often, control remained symbolic until certain conditions were met. The birth of an heir, the death of a parent, or the passage of time could activate these clauses. This delayed transfer allowed both sides to maintain stability while still benefiting from the agreement. Inheritance was equally important. Marriage created claims that extended far into the future. A child born of the union might inherit titles from both parents, uniting previously separate realms. These possibilities were not left to chance. Legal frameworks were established in advance, specifying succession rules in careful detail. Through these mechanisms, borders shifted quietly. A region might become part of a larger kingdom, not through conquest, but through lineage. Subjects might wake one day under a new ruler whose authority was entirely lawful, established decades earlier by a marriage contract. Resistance was often limited, because the change followed recognized rules. Such arrangements also reduced the cost of expansion. War required resources, time, and risk. Marriage required patience, negotiation, and foresight. For many rulers, the latter was preferable. It offered permanence without devastation. However, this system depended on predictability. Unexpected events could disrupt even the most careful planning. A spouse might die young. An heir might fail to survive infancy. A rival claim could emerge from an overlooked branch of a family tree. These possibilities were considered, but never entirely avoidable. To manage this uncertainty, royal families diversified their strategies. Multiple marriages within the same generation created overlapping claims and alliances. This redundancy increased stability but also complexity. Family trees became intricate, sometimes difficult even for contemporaries to navigate. Disputes over inheritance were common. When a marriage created competing claims, conflicts could arise, sometimes escalating into war. In these moments, marriage appeared less as a peaceful solution and more as a delayed source of tension. Yet, even then, the original intention was stability. For individuals within these systems, dowries and inheritance rights defined their worth in measurable terms. A bride's value was often discussed openly, reduced to what she brought with her rather than who she was. This reduction was normalized, treated as practical rather than cruel. Kings and councils justified these practices as necessary. The state's survival depended on secure succession and financial strength. Personal considerations were secondary. Over time, this reasoning became tradition, passed down and rarely questioned. For queens, dowries could be both protection and burden. A substantial dowry increased their standing in their new court, offering leverage and respect. At the same time, it reinforced expectations. Having brought wealth and land, they were expected to produce heirs who would justify the investment. Inheritance shaped relationships long after marriage. The presence or absence of children determined whether territories remained united or returned to previous owners. A childless marriage might dissolve carefully planned transfers, while a successful one could permanently alter political structures. These outcomes unfolded slowly. Generations passed before the full impact of a single marriage became clear. This long perspective suited monarchies, which valued continuity over speed. As centuries progressed, the mechanisms remained largely unchanged. Even as legal systems evolved, the core principles endured. Marriage connected wealth, land, and authority into a single framework. Understanding dowries and inheritance allows us to see royal marriage in practical terms. These unions were not simply social arrangements. They were economic and political instruments, shaping states quietly and persistently. The wedding ceremony marked only the beginning. The real effects emerged over time, carried forward through heirs and administrations. Each contract left traces, shaping the world in subtle ways. In this steady movement of land and title, history advanced without urgency. Power shifted gradually, measured not in victories, but in agreements honored across generations. As we continue, these foundations will support the stories that follow. Behind every alliance lies a ledger, and behind every crown, a contract patiently fulfilled. Among the many royal families who relied on marriage as a tool of power, none did so with greater patience or consistency than the Habsburgs. Their approach was quiet, deliberate, and remarkably long-lived. Rather than expanding primarily through conquest, they allowed influence to accumulate through generations of carefully planned unions. Over time, this method reshaped much of Europe without the urgency of war. The Habsburg strategy was not built on speed. It depended on waiting, observing, and trusting that agreements made in one generation would bear fruit in the next. Where other dynasties sought immediate results through battle or bold declaration, the Habsburgs preferred continuity. Marriage offered exactly that, a way to grow steadily, almost invisibly. From an early stage, Habsburg rulers recognized the value of repetition. Marrying into influential families again and again strengthened ties and reduced uncertainty. Each union reinforced existing relationships, creating layers of connection that were difficult to undo. Over time, these bonds formed a dense network of kinship across courts. This approach required careful record-keeping and deep awareness of lineage. Advisors tracked family trees with meticulous attention, ensuring that each marriage served a specific purpose. Potential matches were evaluated not for novelty, but for reliability. Familiar families offered predictable outcomes. The results unfolded gradually. Territories accumulated not through sudden annexation, but through inheritance. When a ruler died without a direct heir, claims passed along established family lines. Often, a Habsburg relative was already positioned to inherit, thanks to a marriage arranged decades earlier. To observers at the time, this expansion could appear accidental. Borders shifted quietly, titles accumulated. Influence spread without the spectacle of conquest. Yet behind this calm exterior lay decades of planning. This method also minimized resistance. Subjects were more likely to accept a new ruler who arrived through lawful inheritance than one imposed by force. Administration continued largely unchanged. The transition felt familiar, even when authority shifted. Marriage, in this context, functioned as insurance. By securing multiple claims across regions, the Habsburgs reduced the risk of total loss. If one line failed, another might succeed. This redundancy was intentional, built into the system. However, this approach demanded sacrifice from individuals. Habsburg children were raised with a clear understanding of their role. Their marriages were expected to serve long-term objectives, not personal fulfillment. Choices were limited, but predictable. Repetition carried consequences. Marrying within a relatively narrow circle increased familiarity, but also risk. Over generations, the same families became intertwined repeatedly. This reduced political uncertainty, but introduced biological challenges that were not fully understood at the time. Despite this, the strategy persisted. Its success reinforced confidence in the method. As long as territory and influence continued to grow, concerns remained secondary. The Habsburg reliance on marriage also shaped their public image. They were seen as stable, patient, and enduring. Their power appeared less aggressive, more inevitable. Rivals found it difficult to respond to this slow expansion, as there was no clear moment to resist. Diplomacy adjusted accordingly. Other rulers began to recognize the importance of marriage alliances in response. The political landscape grew increasingly interconnected, with fewer truly isolated courts. This network had limits. When disputes arose, the complexity of relationships could intensify conflict. Claims overlapped. Loyalties were divided. Marriage created both unity and tension. Yet even in conflict, the underlying structure remained. Wars often ended with further marriages, restoring balance through familiar means. The system corrected itself through the same tool that had created it. For those living within this world, the pace of change was gentle. Power shifted quietly. Life continued under new rulers who often felt familiar through shared lineage. Continuity was preserved. From a distance, the Habsburg method appears almost restrained. It avoided spectacle. It valued patience over ambition. Its success depended on time rather than force. This approach influenced other dynasties, though few applied it with the same consistency. Marriage became an accepted path to power, not an exception. Understanding this method helps explain how royal marriages shaped history without dramatic moments. Their impact was cumulative, measured in generations rather than years. As we continue, this patience will remain a theme. The quiet work of marriage, repeated over time, altered the course of nations without urgency. In this stillness, power found a durable form, one that required waiting, trust, and acceptance of long horizons. For many royal women, marriage marked the beginning of a long silence. Their importance was unquestioned, yet their influence was often indirect, filtered through expectation, ceremony, and restraint. Queens were central to alliances, symbols of unity between realms, yet their personal voices were rarely recorded and seldom invited into decisions. A queen's journey usually began with departure. Leaving her birthplace was not a private farewell, but a formal event. Processions, blessings, and carefully staged ceremonies accompanied her exit, emphasizing continuity rather than loss. She traveled not as herself, but as a representative of her family and future role. The distance she crossed was measured not only in miles, but in identity. Upon arrival in her new land, everything familiar was replaced. Language shifted. Customs changed. Even daily rhythms felt unfamiliar. Yet, adaptation was expected immediately. There was little tolerance for uncertainty. The queen was to embody stability from the moment she arrived. Her household was reorganized accordingly. While some attendants might accompany her from home, many were replaced by local courtiers loyal to her husband's family. This change ensured integration, but it also reduced personal comfort. Private spaces were monitored. Letters were often read before delivery. Communication with family back home was limited and formal. Publicly, queens appeared composed and serene. They attended ceremonies, observed councils, and participated in religious life. Their presence signaled legitimacy and continuity. Silence was interpreted as dignity. Compliance was praised as virtue. Privately, expectations were clear. A queen was to support a husband, produce heirs, and avoid controversy. Influence, when exercised, had to be subtle. Advice was offered quietly, often through intermediaries. Direct opposition was discouraged. Many queens learned to navigate these boundaries with care. They listened attentively, observed patterns, and chose moments wisely. Influence became a matter of timing and discretion rather than authority. Success depended on patience. Yet this careful approach did not guarantee security. A queen's position was closely tied to her ability to produce children, especially sons. Without an heir, her standing could weaken quickly. Courts were attentive to this outcome, watching closely, though rarely speaking openly. In cases where heirs did not arrive, blame often settled on the queen, regardless of cause. Medical understanding was limited, but expectations remained firm. This pressure was constant, shaping daily life and personal worth. Some queens arrived as children or adolescents, unprepared for the emotional demands of their role. Their education emphasized ceremony and obedience rather than independence. On Simaria, they were expected to mature immediately, carrying responsibility without guidance. Loneliness was common, though seldom acknowledged. Familiar faces were few. Trust was earned slowly, if at all. Isolation became part of routine life. Despite these constraints, queens were not powerless. Their symbolic role granted access. Their lineage connected courts. Their presence mattered. Even silence could communicate. Over time, some queens cultivated networks of influence within the court. They supported charities, religious institutions, or artistic endeavors. These activities were acceptable expressions of agency, allowing queens to shape their environment without challenging authority. Others focused inward, adapting to routine and ceremony as sources of structure. Predictability offered comfort. Repetition reduced uncertainty. Historical records rarely capture these internal experiences. Chroniclers focused on outcomes, births, deaths, alliances. Emotional life remained unrecorded, absorbed into tradition. When queens did assert themselves openly, reactions varied. Some were praised for wisdom, others criticized for ambition. The line between acceptable counsel and interference was narrow and often shifting. Through all of this, the queen's primary role remained unchanged. She was a bridge between families, a guarantor of alliance, and a vessel for continuity. Her individuality was secondary. As generations passed, this pattern repeated. New queens arrived, adapted, and disappeared into history, remembered primarily through their children or the territories they brought with them. Understanding this quiet limitation helps explain why royal marriages endured as they did. The system depended on restraint, acceptance, and silence. Queens were expected to maintain balance without drawing attention to themselves. In this stillness, power moved around them, through them, but rarely, because of them, directly. Their influence was real, but subtle, embedded within routine. As we continue, we will see how this silence shaped dynasties, stabilizing alliances while obscuring individual lives. Royal marriages were sustained not by voices raised, but by voices carefully withheld. And so, queens lived within a structure that valued them deeply, yet heard them rarely present at the center of history, yet quietly removed from its narration. While queens often carried the weight of silence, kings lived under a different, yet equally constraining, set of expectations. Power surrounded them, but freedom did not always accompany it. Their marriages, like those of queens, were rarely chosen. They were assigned, negotiated, and confirmed by the same systems of obligation that governed royal life. From childhood, future kings were taught that personal desire was secondary to stability. Their education emphasized authority, discipline, and responsibility. Marriage was introduced not as companionship, but as necessity. A king without a suitable marriage was incomplete in the eyes of his court. Expectation followed them closely. A king was required to marry promptly, appropriately, and productively. Delays caused concern. Uncertainty invited speculation. Councils watched carefully, aware that succession depended on timely decisions. The choice of spouse was rarely personal. Advisors evaluated potential much as based on lineage, religion, and political advantage. Compatibility was discussed only insofar as it affected stability. Emotional connection was considered unpredictable and therefore unreliable. Once married, the king's role did not soften. Instead, he was expected to govern, represent, and reproduce, often simultaneously. Public appearances with his queen reinforced legitimacy. Private life remained structured by protocol. Despite their authority, kings were not immune to isolation. Court life was formal. Genuine companionship was rare. Trust was limited by politics. Even within marriage, openness was constrained by expectation. Producing an heir was among the king's most urgent duties. Without one, his reign could be questioned. Pressure mounted quietly, but persistently. Each year, without a child, increased anxiety, both personal and political. In many cases, the king's worth became intertwined with succession. Success meant continuity. Failure threatened instability. These stakes shaped behavior, decisions, and personal relationships. Kings who struggled with marriage faced scrutiny. Personal dissatisfaction was tolerated only if it did not interfere with duty. Affairs, while sometimes overlooked, could complicate legitimacy. Discretion was essential. For some kings, marriage became routine rather than relationship. Ceremony replaced intimacy. Roles were fulfilled with efficiency. Emotional distance was normalized. Others attempted to exert control by remarrying, adjusting alliances, or reshaping courts. These actions were not expressions of personal desire, but strategies to restore balance. Kings also bore the burden of visibility. Every decision was public. Every choice carried meaning. Marriage amplified this scrutiny. A queen's behavior reflected on the king, and vice versa. In times of crisis, marriage could become both refuge and liability. A strong alliance provided support. A weak one exposed vulnerability. Kings learned to measure relationships carefully. Despite their power, kings were bound by tradition. Departing from expectation risked instability. Even absolute authority operated within inherited frameworks. As generations passed, the pattern remained. Kings married not for love, but for continuity. Their personal lives became extensions of governance. Understanding this constraint reveals a quieter truth. Power did not grant freedom. It demanded compliance. Kings moved through life with responsibility pressing steadily upon them. Marriage was one of its most enduring forms. In this still structure, kings fulfilled roles designed long before they were born. Their authority rested on acceptance of limits. As we continue, we'll see how these obligations shaped dynasties, reinforcing systems that valued order above all else. Royal marriage, for kings as for queens, was less a personal milestone than a duty patiently endured. In the carefully ordered world of royal marriage, love was not forbidden, but it was inconvenient. It existed quietly at the edges of expectation, acknowledged in theory yet discouraged in practice. Affection, when it appeared, had to adapt to duty rather than challenge it. Royal courts understood that emotional attachment could complicate planning. Love introduced uncertainty. Equality governance sought to minimize. For this reason, personal preference was treated cautiously. It was allowed only when it aligned naturally with political interest and ambient. It was considered a fortunate coincidence rather than a guiding principle. When love emerged where it was not expected, it posed a quiet problem. A prince might favor a partner who lacked suitable lineage. A princess might develop affection for someone without political value. These situations were rarely addressed openly. Instead, they were managed through delay, redirection, or gentle discouragement. Advisors played a central role in this process. They reminded young royals of responsibility, of expectation, of the weight carried by their position. Emotional attachment was framed as fleeting, while duty was presented as enduring. Over time, this reasoning often prevailed. Some royal individuals accepted this logic without protest. Having been raised within the system, they viewed love as secondary. They adjusted expectations, understanding that fulfillment might come from stability rather than passion. Others struggled quietly. Letters reveal moments of longing, though these are rare and often cautious. Expressions of affection were measured, filtered through formality. Emotional honesty carried risk. In some cases, love was permitted only after duty was fulfilled. A politically advantageous marriage would take place first, securing alliances and succession. Personal relationships, if tolerated, were expected to remain discreet and non-disruptive. This arrangement reinforced hierarchy. The state came first. The individual followed. Occasionage, love aligned with politics, creating unions remembered fondly in later These instances stood out precisely because they were uncommon. Chroniclers later emphasized them, perhaps as reassurance that personal happiness was possible, even within constraint. Yet even in these cases, love existed within boundaries. Expectations did not dissolve. The demands of rule remained. Marriage did not grant freedom from obligation. When love conflicted directly with duty, consequences followed. Requests for unsuitable marriages were denied. Relationships were ended quietly. Individuals were separated, sometimes permanently. These outcomes were treated as unfortunate but necessary. The emotional impact of such decisions is difficult to measure. Historical records rarely dwell on inner experience. Silence fills the gaps where personal grief might have been recorded. For women, the consequences were often more severe. A royal woman who expressed preference risked reputation and security. Compliance was safer. Silence preserved position. For men, privilege offered limited flexibility, but not exemption. Kings who defied expectation risked legitimacy. Even personal happiness could be framed as irresponsibility. Over time, the system absorbed these tensions. Love was acknowledged but constrained. It became something to manage rather than pursue. This approach influenced behavior long after marriage. Emotional distance became normal. Intimacy was formalized. Personal fulfillment was sought cautiously, if at all. In this environment, love did not disappear. It adapted. It became quieter, less visible, shaped by patience rather than urgency. Royal individuals learned to distinguish between desire and duty. The latter governed decisions. The former was internalized, sometimes reshaped into acceptance. As generations passed, these patterns repeated. Love remained secondary, occasionally surfacing, then receding into routine. Understanding this tension adds depth to royal marriage without introducing drama. It reveals a system designed to function smoothly, even at personal cost. Marriage was not intended to satisfy the heart. It was meant to stabilize the realm. In this stillness, affection became a private matter, carefully contained. History recorded outcomes, not feelings. As we move forward, this quiet compromise will continue to shape the story. Royal marriages endured not because they were joyful, but because they were controlled. And so, love existed where it could, restrained, adapted, and often set aside, while duty moved steadily on. Within royal marriage, no responsibility carried greater weight than the expectation of producing an heir. While alliances, lands, and diplomacy shaped the structure of marriage, succession gave it urgency. Without a clear heir, even the most carefully arranged union remained incomplete, its purpose unsettled. From the moment a marriage was confirmed, attention turned quietly toward the future. Time was measured not in anniversaries, but in seasons passed without a birth. Courts did not speak openly of this pressure, yet it shaped daily life. Conversations paused when footsteps approached. Observations were made discreetly. Hope and concern moved beneath the surface. An heir represented continuity. Through a child, alliances became permanent, contracts activated, and inheritance secured. The absence of an heir introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty unsettled governance. Councils worried. Nobles speculated. Foreign courts observed closely. This pressure fell unevenly. While both parents were involved, responsibility was most often assigned to the queen. Medical knowledge was limited, but expectation was not. Each passing year without a child weakened her position, regardless of cause. Sympathy existed privately, but judgment followed quietly. Pregnancy was both hopeful and precarious. It brought anticipation, yet also risk. Childbirth carried danger, and survival was never guaranteed. Even successful births did not always resolve uncertainty. Infancy was fragile. Loss was common, though rarely recorded in detail. When a child survived, attention shifted immediately to legitimacy. Lineage was examined carefully. Records were maintained with precision. Witnesses were present at births, not out of celebration, but to confirm authenticity. Even the most intimate moments were observed through a political lens. The birth of a son carried particular significance. While daughters were valuable for future alliances, sons ensured direct succession. This distinction shaped behavior and expectation. Celebrations differed. Relief was deeper. In families where daughters were born repeatedly, concern grew quietly. Advisors reassured rulers while exploring alternatives. Marriage strategies adjusted. Alliances were reconsidered. The absence of a male heir altered long-term planning. For kings, the lack of an heir threatened authority. Questions arose about succession. Rival claims gained attention. The stability of the realm depended on clarity. Without it, loyalty weakened. In some cases, this pressure led to remarriage. Widowed or childless kings sought new unions in hopes of securing succession. These decisions were practical, often swift. Emotional consideration remained secondary. For queens, repeated pregnancies and losses took a toll that history rarely acknowledged. Their bodies became instruments of continuity. Rest was limited. Expectation remained constant. Religious belief influenced interpretation. Success was attributed to favor. Failure was sometimes seen as judgment. Rituals were performed quietly. Prayers repeated patiently. Throughout this process, the personal experience of parenthood was overshadowed by political significance. A child was both family member and symbol. Affection existed, but expectation framed it. Children themselves grew up aware of this role. From early years, they were reminded of their importance. Education began quickly. Preparation resumed. In cases where no heir emerged, uncertainty lingered. Succession crises unfolded slowly, sometimes over decades. Claims overlapped. Conflict became possible. Marriage, once stabilizing, became a source of tension. Yet even in these moments, the system persisted. New strategies emerged. Adoption of distant relatives, revised inheritance laws. Marriage remained central. Understanding this pressure reveals the quiet urgency beneath royal marriage. While daily life appeared calm, the future was constantly assessed. The expectation of an heir shaped relationships, routines, and decisions. It was not dramatic, but persistent. As generations passed, this pattern repeated. Birth, hope, loss, and preparation followed one another steadily. Royal marriage was never complete until succession was secure. Until then, everything remained provisional. In this stillness, the future waited patiently, shaped by fragile beginnings. Not all royal marriages achieved the stability they were designed to secure. Some, despite careful planning, settled into quiet difficulty. These failures were rarely sudden or dramatic. Instead, they unfolded slowly through absence, distance, and unresolved expectation. When marriage did not function as intended, the consequences were felt not only within households, but across entire realms. A failed royal marriage was not defined by emotional unhappiness alone. Many unions lacked affection and yet fulfilled their political purpose. Failure emerged when the structure itself weakened, when alliances faltered, heirs did not arrive, or cooperation between families diminished. These shortcomings introduced uncertainty, which monarchies worked carefully to avoid. Such situations were managed discreetly. Courts avoided public acknowledgement of marital strain. Silence was preferred to explanation. Appearances were maintained. Ceremonies continued. Public unity masked private difficulty. Annulments and separations, though rare, occurred under specific conditions. Religious authorities were consulted. Legal arguments were constructed patiently. Grounds were established carefully, often framed around technicalities rather than personal dissatisfaction. The process was slow and deliberate, minimizing disruption. When a marriage ended formally, it sent ripples through diplomatic networks. Alliances weakened. Agreements tied to the union required revision. Dowries were reconsidered. Inheritances were disputed. Each change demanded negotiation. More often, marriages failed quietly without formal dissolution. Spouses lived apart, either physically or emotionally. Distance became routine. Communication diminished. These arrangements were tolerated as long as public order remained intact. In such cases, courts adapted. Advisors adjusted expectations. Attention shifted toward alternative strategies. Secondary marriages within the family were emphasized. Succession planning expanded outward to include distant relatives. For individuals within these marriages, daily life continued under strain. Roles were fulfilled, but connection remained limited. Routine replaced intimacy. The structure endured, even when the spirit did not. Queens in unsuccessful marriages were particularly vulnerable. Without strong alliance or heir, their position weakened. Support diminished quietly. Influence faded. Some were relocated to secondary residences, where life became smaller and more predictable. Kings faced different pressures. A failed marriage reflected on their authority. Questions arose, even if unspoken. Advisors urged resolution, whether through renewed effort, separation, or remarriage. These situations rarely resolved quickly. Years passed while courts waited, observed, and adjusted. Time itself became a tool, allowing emotions to cool and strategies to evolve. In cases where no solution emerged, instability lingered. Rival claims gained attention. Foreign powers reassessed relationships. What began as a personal difficulty expanded into political concern. Yet even then, the response remained measured. Monarchies favored continuity. Abrupt change risked disorder. Patience was valued. Historical records often compress these periods, summarizing decades of uncertainty in a few lines. The slow pace of crisis was highly overlooked. Yet, for those living within it, the tension was constant. Marriage, once intended as resolution, became an unresolved question. Its failure did not explode. It lingered. Despite this, the system adapted. New alliances formed. Laws evolved. Marriage remained central, even as individual unions faltered. These quiet crises reveal an important truth. Royal marriage was not guaranteed to succeed, but the structure surrounding it was resilient. The system absorbed failure without collapsing. As generations passed, lessons accumulated. Contracts became more detailed. Expectations adjusted. Flexibility increased slightly, though never fully. Understanding these silent failures helps explain the endurance of monarchy. Stability was not dependent on perfection, but on adaptation. Marriage could falter, but governance continued. Life moved forward. In this quiet persistence, power endured not through harmony, but through management. As we continue, we will see how these challenges influence dynasties, shaping decisions long after the original marriages faded from memory. Royal marriage was never immune to difficulty. It simply learned to endure it quietly. In many royal marriages, faith rested quietly in the background, shaping decisions without always drawing attention to itself. Religion was not merely a matter of belief. It was a framework through which legitimacy, authority, and loyalty were understood. When marriages crossed religious boundaries, they introduced a subtle tension that required careful management. For much of history, ruler and religion were closely linked. A monarch's faith was assumed to reflect the faith of the realm. This connection made marriage a sensitive matter. A spouse brought not only lineage and land, but also religious identity, which could influence succession, law, and public trust. Negotiating a marriage across religious lines required patience. Advisors examined doctrines, traditions, and expectations in detail. Questions arose quietly. Would the spouse convert? Would children be raised in one faith or another? How would ceremonies be conducted? Each decision carried weight. Often, compromises were written into marriage contracts. Private worship might be permitted while public conformity was expected. Children's religious upbringing was specified in careful language. These agreements aimed to preserve balance, allowing alliance without provoking unrest. Despite such precautions, anxiety persisted. Subjects watched closely. Religious leaders expressed concern, sometimes openly, sometimes in private council. The presence of a spouse of differing faith reminded people that unity was fragile. Queens bore much of this burden. As visible symbols of alliance, their beliefs were scrutinized. A queen practicing an unfamiliar faith could become a focus of suspicion, regardless of her conduct. Silence and restraint were essential. Kings faced pressure to uphold religious consistency. Their authority depended partly on spiritual legitimacy. Any perceived wavering could weaken confidence. Marriage, therefore, had to reinforce, not undermine, religious stability. In some cases, conversion resolved tension. A spouse adopted the faith of their new realm, sometimes sincerely, sometimes formally. This act was presented as harmony restored. Public reassurance followed. In other cases, conversion was resisted or delayed. These situations required careful handling. Public ceremonies emphasized unity. Differences were kept private. Over time, attention shifted elsewhere. When compromise failed, conflict could emerge. Religious division intensified existing political strain. Marriage, once intended as bridge, became a point of contention. These moments were unsettling, though often gradual. Succession complicated matters further. Heirs embodied the future of both dynasty and faith. Their religious identity mattered deeply. Education was closely supervised. Rituals were observed with precision. Disputes over succession sometimes traced back to marriage decisions made decades earlier. What seemed manageable at the time revealed long-term consequences. Religious alignment shaped alliances and opposition alike. Despite these challenges, royal families continued to pursue cross-faith marriages when politically advantageous. The benefits were considered worth the risk. Stability could be restored through careful governance. For individuals within these marriages, daily life required vigilance. Personal belief became secondary to public responsibility. Practice was adjusted. Expression was measured. Historical records often describe these unions in neutral terms, focusing on outcomes rather than tension. The quiet effort required to maintain balance is rarely noted. Yet this effort was constant. Religious difference did not disappear. It was managed through ceremony, language, and restraint. Monarchies preserved order. As time passed, some realms grew more accustomed to tolerance increased slightly, though never fully. Marriage played a role in this gradual adjustment. Understanding the role of religion in royal marriage reveals another layer of complexity. These unions balanced not only families and lands, but belief systems. Marriage served as a testing ground for coexistence. Success depended on patience, discretion, and willingness to adapt. As we move forward, this balance between unity and division will continue to shape dynastic history, quietly influencing decisions and outcomes. Royal marriage, once again, proved resilient, capable of absorbing difference while preserving structure. In royal life, uncertainty was tolerated only briefly. When years passed without the birth of an heir, quiet concern began to spread. The absence of succession did not create immediate crisis, but it introduced a slow unease that settled into councils, courts, and distant alliances. Everything continued as before, yet nothing felt fully settled. An heir was more than a child. It was confirmation that the future had direction. Without one, authority felt temporary, even when power appeared strong. Monarchs understood this instinctively. Stability depended not only on rule in the present, but on continuity beyond it. At first, patience prevailed. Time was allowed. Reassurance circulated quietly. Advisors reminded one another that many rulers had children later in life. Hope was maintained through routine and ceremony. Public.com was preserved carefully. As years passed, planning shifted subtly. Councils expanded their discussions. Distant relatives were reviewed. Legal scholars examined inheritance laws with renewed interest. None of this was announced openly, yet everyone understood its purpose. For queens, this period was especially heavy. Their position depended closely on succession. Without a child, their role appeared incomplete. Sympathy existed privately, but expectation remained unchanged. Time did not soften judgment. It sharpened it. Daily life continued under observation. Health was monitored. Rituals were repeated. Advice was offered gently, sometimes repeatedly. Silence filled the spaces where reassurance might have been. Kings faced a different pressure. Their authority rested on strength and clarity. Without an heir, questions followed them quietly. Rivals observed. Foreign courts recalculated alliances. Loyalty, though intact, felt conditional. In some cases, this uncertainty encouraged speculation. Competing claims gained attention. Ambitious relatives positioned themselves carefully. What had once been theoretical became increasingly relevant. Marriage once a stabilizing force, now revealed its limits. Without succession, alliances remained fragile. Contracts written decades earlier depended on an outcome that had not arrived. Legal systems attempted to provide structure. Succession laws were clarified. Contingencies were outlined. These measures offered reassurance, but not certainty. Law could guide transition, but it could not replace lineage. For individuals within the marriage, personal experience became secondary to public concern. Private disappointment existed, but it was rarely acknowledged. Duty demanded composure. In some courts, pressure led to reconsideration of the marriage itself. Advisors explored options cautiously. Annulment, remarriage, or secondary unions were discussed quietly. Each carried risk. Such decisions were never taken lightly. Ending a marriage disrupted alliances and raised questions of legitimacy. Yet prolonged uncertainty posed its own dangers. Balance was difficult to achieve. In other cases, patience endured. Monarchs aged without heirs. Courts adjusted slowly. Acceptance replaced expectation. Planning focused on the next most stable option. This period of waiting shaped governance. Decisions were made with awareness that transition could arrive unexpectedly. Conservatism increased. Risk was avoided. Stability was preserved through restraint. For subjects, the absence of an heir created subtle tension. Rumors circulated quietly. Loyalty remained. But curiosity grew. People wondered who would follow and what changes might come. Religious institutions played a role as well. Prayers were offered publicly. Rituals emphasized continuity. Faith provided language for patience and acceptance. When succession finally resolved, whether through birth, designation, or inheritance, relief followed. The uncertainty that had lingered quietly was replaced by clarity. The system resumed its familiar rhythm. Yet the years of waiting left traces. Relationships had shifted. Expectations adjusted. History moved forward, shaped by a gap that had once seemed temporary. In cases where no resolution arrived before death, transition unfolded carefully. Councils acted. Laws were invoked. Authority passed according to established rules. The system functioned, though quietly tested. These moments reveal the limits of royal marriage. It could plan align and stabilize, but it could not guarantee outcome. Human fragility remained part of the equation. Understanding the cost of no heir deepens our view of monarchy. Power depended not only on strength, but on continuity. Absence created space for uncertainty. Yet even in these moments, governance endured. Structures adapted. Authority transferred. The realm continued. Royal marriage, once again, proved resilient. It could withstand absence, though not without strain. As we move forward, this quiet resilience will guide the final chapters, showing how dynasties absorbed uncertainty and carried history onward. When royal marriages succeeded in producing heirs and maintaining stability, their influence gradually expanded beyond the household. What began as a personal union between two individuals often became, over time, a political union between territories, institutions, and populations. These transitions were rarely sudden. They unfolded quietly, shaped by law, tradition, and patient administration. At first, the union existed primarily in symbol. The marriage represented alliance, goodwill, and shared interest. Courts acknowledged it through ceremony and diplomacy. Titles were exchanged. Heraldry blended, yet each realm remained distinct, governed by its own laws and customs. As years passed and heirs matured, the union took on greater substance. A child born of the marriage embodied continuity between two lineages. Their inheritance carried implications that extended far beyond family. When that child inherited authority, the separate strands of lineage began to intertwine more closely. In some cases, a single ruler came to hold multiple titles through inheritance. This did not immediately merge territories, but it linked them under one authority. Administration remained separate. Laws continued as before. The change was subtle, often unnoticed by daily life. Over time, however, practical considerations encouraged cooperation. Shared governance simplified communication. Advisors served multiple realms. Policies aligned gradually. What began as convenience slowly became structure. These developments were guided by precedent rather than ambition. Monarchs did not always seek full unification. Often, it emerged as the most stable option available. Maintaining separate systems required constant negotiation. Integration offered predictability. Subjects adjusted quietly. Allegiance shifted not through force, but through familiarity. The ruler was known, even if distant. Authority felt continuous rather than imposed. Marriage thus became a mechanism for expansion that avoided disruption. Borders blurred without disappearing. Identity evolved slowly. The pace allowed resistance to soften. Legal frameworks supported this process. Succession laws clarified authority. Treaties confirmed arrangements. Institutions adapted. Each step was deliberate. In some regions, these unions laid foundations for modern states. What began as dynastic convenience matured into political reality. Shared governance became accepted norm. Yet, not all unions progressed in this way. Some remained personal, their political impact limited. Context mattered. Geography, culture, and local resistance shaped outcomes. When unions succeeded, they demonstrated the long-term potential of marriage as influence extended not through conquest, but through continuity. For individuals involved, this process unfolded beyond their lifetime. Decisions made in youth shaped generations yet unborn. The full impact was rarely visible to those who initiated it. This distance between action and outcome defined royal marriage. Its power lay in patience. Understanding this progression helps explain how Europe and other regions developed their political structures. Marriage connected families. Families shaped states. As we approach the final chapters, this quiet evolution will guide our reflection on legacy and change. Royal marriage, once personal, became political through time, not by force, but by inheritance and adaptation. By the time royal marriages began to enter the modern era, the structures surrounding them had already changed in subtle ways. Tradition remained powerful, but it no longer stood entirely alone. Law, public opinion, and evolving ideas of governance slowly altered how marriage functioned within monarchy. The shift was not sudden, and it was never complete, but it marked a noticeable change in tone. Constitutional limits reshaped royal authority. Kings and queens no longer ruled solely by inherited right. Parliaments, councils, and written law increasingly defined their power. Within this framework, marriage remained important, but its consequences became less absolute. Succession still mattered, yet the survival of the state no longer depended entirely on a single bloodline. Institutions had grown stronger. Governments could endure change without collapse. This reduced the pressure placed upon individual marriages. Public visibility also increased. Royal lives became more exposed, observed not only by courts, but by citizens. Newspapers, portraits, and later photography presented monarchs as public figures. Marriage, once negotiated quietly, now unfolded before wider audiences. With visibility came expectation. The public began to value personal happiness alongside duty. Royal marriages were still symbolic, but symbolism expanded. A contented couple suggested stability of a different kind. This did not mean that choice replaced obligation. Advisors still guided decisions. Alliances were still considered, yet preference gained cautious recognition. Compatibility was discussed, though carefully. In some cases, royals were permitted to marry within acceptable circles rather than strict political necessity. These unions maintained status while allowing limited autonomy. Tradition adapted without disappearing. Resistance existed. Older expectations persisted. Not all marriages were freely chosen. Many compromises were required. The shift was uneven, varying by region and period. Religious constraints softened some areas. Cultural boundaries relaxed slightly. Marriage expanded from pure strategy toward social continuity. Still, the past remained present. Titles, inheritance, and expectation continued to shape decisions. Choice existed within boundaries, not beyond them. This gradual change altered the tone of royal life. Marriage became less about securing territory and more about representing continuity in a changing world. Stability was expressed through example rather than control. Public ceremonies reflected this shift. Language softened, emphasis moved toward partnership. Yet beneath this surface, structure endured. Royal individuals navigated these changes carefully. They balanced tradition with adaptation. Their marriages reflected both heritage and modernity. This period did not erase the past. It transformed it gently. Royal marriage evolved from rigid instrument to moderated symbol. As the system adjusted, the core remained recognizable. Marriage still linked families, shaped succession, and carried meaning beyond the personal. Understanding this shift prepares us for the final reflection. Royal marriage did not abandon its purpose. It adapted to survive. In quiet transition, monarchy found continuity not in rigidity, but in careful change. When viewed from a distance, royal marriages can appear ornamental, surrounded by ceremony and softened by time. Yet their true legacy lies not in spectacle, but in quiet consequence. Across centuries, these unions shaped borders, stabilized transitions, and guided the slow movement of history. Their influence was subtle, persistent, and enduring. Most royal marriages did not transform the world in dramatic moments. They worked gradually. Agreements signed in one generation produced effects felt 2 or 3 generations later. The individuals involved rarely witnessed the full outcome of their own unions. Their lives passed within a system whose purpose extended far beyond personal experience. Through marriage, dynasties connected themselves to the future. Alliances became familial. Rivals became relatives. Power moved through inheritance rather than force. This method reduced open conflict, though it did not eliminate tension. It replaced immediacy with patience. The legacy of these marriages can still be seen in modern borders, legal traditions, and constitutional structures. Many states emerged not from conquest alone, but from generations of shared lineage. Administrative continuity followed bloodlines. Authority transferred quietly. Royal families themselves became living archives of history. Their family trees reflected centuries of negotiation, compromise, and adaptation. Each branch told a story of intention and consequence. For the individuals involved, however, legacy was more abstract. Their personal sacrifices rarely entered historical memory. Queens remembered for children rather than character. Kings judged by succession rather than sentiment. Their inner lives faded quietly. This absence does not diminish their role. Instead, it highlights the nature of the system they inhabited. Royal marriage was not designed to preserve individuality. It existed to ensure continuity. As monarchies evolved, the direct political power of marriage softened. Institutions replaced bloodline as guarantors of stability, yet marriage retained symbolic weight. It continued to represent connection between past and present. Modern royal marriages reflect this layered legacy. They balance tradition with expectation, ceremony with choice. Though no longer essential to state survival, they remain meaningful, carrying echoes of their former purpose. The shift did not erase history, it absorbed Italiano. The rituals, language, and formality endure. Because they remind people of continuity, they anchored the present to the past. Looking back, royal marriages reveal a history shaped by restraint rather than impulse. Decisions were made slowly. Change unfolded carefully. Power moved without urgency. This pace suited monarchy. It allowed adaptation without collapse. When marriages failed, systems adjusted. When heirs were absent, laws intervened. When alliances weakened, new ones formed. Through all of this, marriage remained central. It was the quiet thread connecting generations. Understanding this legacy invites a calmer view of history. Rather than focusing on drama, we see process. Rather than seeking heroes, we observe systems. Rather than celebrating romance, we recognize responsibility. Royal marriages were not stories of passion. They were stories of endurance. They asked individuals to accept limits. They asked families to think beyond themselves. They asked nations to trust continuity over change. And in doing so, they shaped the world gradually, almost invisibly. As this story comes to rest, there is no final triumph or failure to announce. Only the quiet recognition that history often moves forward, not through loud moments, but through patient arrangements. Royal marriages were among those arrangements, steady, deliberate, and lasting. They remind us that behind every crown passed down, every border settled, and every dynasty remembered. There were lives lived within expectation, fulfilling roles designed long before they began. And so, history continues, not with a sudden ending, but with the same calm persistence that carried it forward all along. As this story comes to rest, there is no final lesson to hold on to, and no conclusion you need to remember. The world shaped by royal marriages moved forward slowly, through patience rather than passion, through agreement rather than force. And just as history continues quietly, so too may your rest continue without interruption. Thank you for listening. May your night remain calm and your sleep come.